You'll forgive me at once, gentlemen, if the sound quality is not up to par, or up to what you normally expect. I am, unfortunately, still stuck in the infernal realm of Rome, under the orb of fire that some men call the sun, and thus I do not have access to my Rhodes Podcaster, that very fine mic that produces high sound quality. I am currently using my headset. And it is with deep sadness that I must proceed to make this video with this abominable sound quality, but I have little choice. For the thoughts in my mind, in my head, swirl about like little ants, scurrying about the ground, seeking to escape. I have no choice but to make this video. So forgive me. In any event, very recently, in a joint hangout between Barbarossa and many others, the topic came up as to what drives the economy. I believe I Am Serious brought this up, and Barbarossa pointed out that at least indirectly, women in some sense drive the economy. That is to say, excess male labor is siphoned off in the service of women, the service of reproduction, in order to meet the reproductive needs of the species, essentially. And I've often thought about this topic and this question with respect to civilization as a whole. Barbarossa posited the idea that men need to learn to do things based off of their own motivations, independent of the female. Unfortunately, I'm a bit skeptical of this. Now, many, if not most of us, have hobbies, things that we do, and things we enjoy doing. Indeed, many of these things we pursue with varying degrees of what one might call passion. But there exists a rather large number of occupations, jobs, activities that are downright unpleasant, and men, as shepherds of the human race, in the real sense, are the only ones who are willing to do these jobs. Now, the question that comes to mind is, yes, if we detach ourselves from the desire to serve the female and the desire to simply give away excess labor for the sake of reproduction, what are we left with? Now, ultimately, this goes back to many of the discussions that have been had on the topic of MGTOW motivation. And indeed, there is a difference. For myself, I've had to rediscover new reasons for doing things. After all, if at one point in time in the far distant past you, just as an example, decided to go to the gym to look good, in air quotes, that reason is not going to be very sufficient if you are a fully conscious man going your own way. Instead, there are other reasons. The prevention of muscular atrophy, the strengthening of the joints, and just feeling good overall, doing some sort of exercise as opposed to none. But simply looking good, particularly looking good as compared to other men for the sake of women, is not a very good reason anymore. And it certainly wouldn't be reason enough, therefore motivation enough, to head to the gym. But there are, of course, many, many different activities that men still engage in passionately. Gaming, modding, studying different subjects. But as I said, there are things outside of these passions that are quite different in the demands that they put on men. What are some of the activities I'm talking about? Well, working in the sewers, working on telephone poles, Alaskan crab fishing, working on oil rigs, spelunking, working in mines, all these things, and these are just a few examples, very dangerous, very unpleasant, and things that virtually only men do. There are probably a few exceptions, but virtually only men do these activities. And the likelihood that most of these men do it for the sake of fun and passion is pretty slim, I would argue. No, they do it for other reasons. They're compensated well. They have families to feed. as the old saying goes. But in a hypothetical world where most men are going their own way in some sense, where does the motivation reside to do those sorts of things? After all, you need only watch a documentary film on Africa, look at the male lions, and the female ones for that matter. Conservation of energy is something quite natural to all animals, including human beings. We, just as all other animals, tend to do that which is required and not much beyond that. So what would motivate us to go beyond that? There needs to be something extraordinary. Now, hitherto, this has been, of course, the female, the needs for reproduction, and the fact that the man could pass along his seed as a consequence of engaging in these dangerous and very, very difficult activities. But without that, the question is, who's going to do the hard work? Now, up until recently, fairly comparatively recently, much of civilization was built on the backs of slave labor. I mean, comparatively recently, yes, much of civilization was built upon the back of slave labor. And somehow a new formula was worked out. But I'm deeply skeptical of the idea that most men would want to go beyond the conservation of energy, doing things that are dangerous, not fun, not enjoyable, without being incentivized. And for most men, unfortunately, the incentive is reproductive access. As for myself, I would never engage in those activities. The closest thing I've ever come to moving heavy furniture for a while when I was in my 20s, working in a warehouse, physical labor, relatively demanding but not extremely dangerous for the most part. And even those activities really just didn't appeal to me. I certainly wouldn't be working in an oil rig or hanging out in the freezing waters of Alaska going crab fishing. That's just not me, even if I were incentivized. Now, I would argue there are only a few sorts of men that might do that, but still, what happens when we have a kind of MGTOW revelation? The question, of course, was posed to Barbarossa. What happens when critical mass is reached? Well, all kinds of things could happen, and I'm just speculating here. I honestly don't think there's going to be a critical MGTOW mass in the sense that we might be thinking. Yes, there are many varieties and sorts of men going their own way. Some abstain completely from women, some date, some engage in various sexual escapades, and some do all of the above, none of the above, and mixtures. The most important thing and defining characteristic is not engaging in marriage. This in of itself, I don't think is enough. However, if you were to get a certain number, or rather a great number, of those sorts of MGTOW who simply abstain from women altogether, and the numbers became apparent, that is glaring to the eyes of others, that could cause some serious ruckus, if you will, in the greater body of society, and people might take notice. The marriage thing, frankly speaking, is, if you look at some of the data out there, isn't just unique to men. A lot of women don't want to get married either. It's not quite in the ballpark as men, statistically speaking, in terms of the numbers. So marriage in and of itself is sort of on the way out. What is most crucial in this equation is examining how men and women interact and what the nature of that interaction is going to be in the future. How much interaction will there be? Now, of course, most men are dependent on women for their sexual needs, and I suspect that will remain so. Most men do not want or cannot refrain from that, and that's fine. So let's assume that in the future, marriage is just a thing of the past. It's already on the way out. It's dying, at least in the West, and to some extent in the East as well. What remains? Well, this is going to really come down to how men and women interact. And frankly speaking, without the codified nature of a formal marriage contract, whereby the man brings home his surplus labor in the form of cash, in order to feed his offspring and the woman that he procreated with, a lot of things are going to change. I mean, even now, this was years ago. Remember when Girl Writes What made that video about Xbox culture, beer, buddies, blah, blah, blah? Most, as we are all animals, most animals, including ourselves, we don't want to expend excess energy. I certainly don't. I still engage in my passions, and even in some cases, I'll do things that I don't find particularly pleasant. I don't really enjoy exercising, but I do it because of necessity. But certain things, the really hard jobs, not necessarily in the sense that they're difficult to grasp or comprehend, but the jobs that are punishing, who in their right mind is going to do that? I mean, perhaps if the compensation were so excessive, one might consider doing that. But generally speaking, you're not going to be earning millions of dollars working in a sewer system. Probably not. But somebody has to do it, I imagine. Now, of course, you could offer the idea of robot labor. That is a possibility. And who knows, maybe sometime in the future that will become available. But we are slowly entering into something that is very, very, very different from what we've seen thus far. Now, I tend to stick with what I think is accurate and what can be observed, even if the news is unpleasant in that regard. And it might be that without the formal institution of marriage, men just are not very motivated to do all the dangerous, dirty, and difficult things that need to get done in order to maintain civilization. I'm talking about on a mass scale. It might be that you need that reproductive contract in order to motivate men. As I said in the past, a lot of civilization was built off the back of slave labor, and I'm not saying that we're going to plunge back into the depths of slavery, but there are all alternatives. After all, the military draft, was something fairly recent, actually, and was only done away with, say, in the last 40 or so years in the United States, and many, many other countries still have a military draft for men. Could this not be applied to other forms of labor? Potentially. I'm speculating here, but I'm just thinking. In a world where male labor becomes a thing of scarcity, that is, the really hard stuff that men only do in order to get paid a lot of money so they can bring home the bacon, and not necessarily to themselves, what would that world look like? Well, we might not have something such as a military draft, but there might be some sort of government policy or government system or program whereby men are forced to engage in these activities. Of course, they're fed and given board and what have you. I'm just speculating here. I don't know what exactly would happen, but the reality is that without those kinds of men who are doing that kind of dangerous work, in the long run, we're all fucked. Men, women, everyone. And I'm certainly not willing to do it, and I bet most of you aren't willing to do it. Not for yourself, at least. I mean, what's the benefit, an example, in being a miner? Yeah, I guess you could make a lot of money potentially, but the risks might outweigh the rewards. And when you don't have to feed spawn, when you don't have to feed offspring, and you don't have to feed the female that you've procreated with, well, it's just wholly unnecessary to engage in that kind of activity. So there could be something like a labor draft in the future, maybe, if it were to ever come to that. A labor draft that wouldn't be too dissimilar to a military draft, except you would be engaging in hard labor. And of course, it almost certainly only would be applied to men because, well, for all the reasons already cited, only men do these sorts of jobs. Only men would be the ones who refrain from doing these sorts of jobs, and only men are the ones, for the most part, with a growing conscious, at least in the MGTOW circles, of the true nature of the relationship between the male and the female, without the stars, without the fairy tales, without the ether, without the beautiful night sky. Yeah, all that bullshit. That is something to seriously consider. What are the long-term consequences? And I think something along the lines of a labor draft would not be completely out of the question. What becomes of civilization? I mean, let's face it. The world is better off without too many Stardusks for many reasons, not least of which because I'm never going to be working in a mine, or, well, never say never, but hopefully I would never choose to work in a mine or on an oil rig or do any of this super dangerous work because it's not required for my subsistence and it's not required for my existence. But there are men out there willing to do that, and it's certainly laudable to some extent that they're willing to do it. The question is, why are they doing it? It's very, very rare that they're willing to do it just for themselves. Usually they have, quote unquote, families to feed. So we do see this slowly unraveling, and as both men and women more and more refuse to participate in the marriage contract, we're going to see a ripple effect because up until now, what the data tell us is that marriage was probably the most stable arrangement for raising children, and there's already a decline in birth rates overall, certainly in Western Europe. And the consequence of this, long term, could be something that goes in the direction I was just describing. I could be completely off in my prediction. It's not even a prediction, my speculation rather, completely off in my speculation. But then again, it could also be something that could come to pass. I don't know. But we should, in going our own way, at least speculate and think seriously about this topic, because there's a difference between still pursuing your passions, the things you enjoy that don't cause you pain or injury, and going the extra mile, surplus labor. We are, in many ways, we who go our own way, akin to those lions who, not lazily, but in the sense of energy conservation, lie under the tree on the plains of Africa in order to not expend excess energy. There's no need to for us. But unfortunately, for better or worse, in the recent past, that excess energy has been the energy expended by men, and it's been the energy that has upheld civilization as we know it. Women aren't going to do that, ever. Never. Now, the only thing I can think of that might intervene is some sort of robotic intervention or creation or what have you, but who knows? I'm not making predictions, I'm just speculating, but it's something that we need to think seriously about. Barbarossa also pointed out to the fact, and I think it is a fact, that in some sense, going your own way is selfish, right? Because all the blue pill men out there that are still engaging in the normal activities, providing for their families, their wives, and what have you, they are in some sense allowing our existence, not because we're mooching off of them, but they're giving us cover. They're the ones making us largely invisible. Now, I know there is a not so small subset of people that want to see MGTOW just grow to the point of insanity. After all, it's not the motto of the illustrious Sandman to grow MGTOW at all costs. I'm not so sure that's a good thing these days. It's not because I want MGTOW to be an exclusive club, as it's sometimes claimed, but for the very reasons that Barbarossa pointed out in that conference video he had. If 90% of men start going their own way, everyone's going to start to take notice. Everyone is going to think about something that needs to be done about these men. Now, I'm going to make a poor analogy here, but bear with me as a fan of Skyrim. Those of you who played Dawnguard, you know that there's a conflict between the vampire faction that, once upon discovering the Elder Scroll that would allow them to blot out the sun and thus usher in eternal darkness over the lands of Skyrim, and that conflict, their desire versus the desire of the other vampires who think, no, that would bring them into a conflict with humans, with mortals, whose numbers far outweigh the numbers of vampires, no matter what the vampiric power might be, and that would be almost certain annihilation. Thus, we should not pursue the Elder Scroll that will allow us to blot out the sun and usher in eternal darkness. Well, call me a traitor vampire, but I think I belong to the faction that does not wish to usher in eternal darkness over the land. That is, I don't think it's a good thing that MGTOW just every man starts going his own way. Certainly, if that's what they want to do, that's a good thing, I guess. But the blue pill world gives us cover. It allows us to live the lives we live in relative ease without too much disturbance. If every Tom, Dick, and Harry starts going his own way, the world will take notice. The government will take notice. Now, right now, it's more of a niche thing. And quite frankly, I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't need every human being, every man to go his own way for me to feel okay about what I'm doing in my life. I don't need to define myself. I just do what I do because that's just me. I'm an individual. But we should think about the long-term consequences of every man going his own way in whatever sense he chooses to grasp that, because when that happens, once again, the analogy of the vampires ushering the eternal darkness by blotting out the sun, the mortals will take notice. The blue pill people will take notice. The government will take notice. Women en masse will take notice, and they will demand that something be done. They will demand that something be done, and we will not be safe. We will not be safe to pursue our own things, to do our own thing, to just go our own way. We're going to be prevented from going our own way. So as much as I think it's important to spread the MGTOW message, and certainly if a man feels that is the appropriate path for him, he should, but there's nothing prescriptive about that, either in the context of MGTOW, at least for me, and certainly in the context of not going your own way. I understand why men don't go their own way, and if that's what they want to do, that's fine. But I also can recognize that all those men not going their own way are giving me cover, and the rest of us cover, because as all the aforementioned things, all the dirty, dangerous, and dastardly jobs that no one does, and even few men do, all the things that are done in order to uphold and maintain what we know as human civilization, that's going to become difficult. When men just wholesale turn their backs on women, people are going to take notice. So I, for one, actually would prefer not to blot out the sun. And I think at the core, this is why I'm opposed to the idea of spreading MGTOW at all costs. First off, which is, as we know, a common motivation for some people. First off, by doing so, MGTOW becomes pretty nebulous. You just have basically an acronym, and the acronym is spread to the far-flung reaches of Earth with little meaning behind it. But more importantly, for me at least, MGTOW is about understanding the human animal. And understanding the human animal is possible whether we number in the millions, the billions, or only the few thousands, as is currently the case. This is something to seriously consider, gentlemen. Do we truly wish to blot out the sun, that the mortals might take notice of us and then thereby, by dint of their numbers only, annihilate us? Or do we keep to the darkness? I, for one, prefer to keep to the darkness. I do not want the mortals to become aware of us. I do not want them to rise up against us. I want to be left in peace to engage in the activities I engage in, and certainly pursuing knowledge, pursuing information, helping out men via the path of knowledge. That's what I'd like to do. But to do that, I don't need a legion of millions and millions of men, and none of us do. So something to seriously consider, the long-term consequences of a so-called critical mass. Blotting out the sun. If the sun is blotted out, people will take notice, and there will be serious, serious consequences, no doubt. And consequences going up to the highest chain, that is, the government, the people in charge, not just people on Reddit or the internet, people who actually make policy. Something to seriously consider, gentlemen. So, I'm going to leave it off here. Once again, I'm terribly sorry for the sound quality, but I hope you are able to look past that, or rather hear past that, and concentrate on the content. And once I am back in the Germanic realms, I shall once again have access to a better mic. But as I said, I found it very difficult to simply, when I have thoughts going in my mind that I think are worthy of video, I want to post them, I want to express them, and you'll just have to bear with it. Most of you mature can deal with that. Thanks for watching as always, and next video in all likelihood will be done, made in Germany. Made in Germany, I like that one. So assuming I'm survive the trip and everything, I'll see you back then. Everyone take care, and thanks for watching as always. And as always, may your chosen God watch over you. Bye-bye.